Her billionaire husband replaced her name at the museum opening. She left with the donor files. Serafina Voss learned she had been erased 2 minutes before the applause began. A cold line flashed across her phone. Your access to the donor archive has been updated. While she stood beneath the museum lights in a vivid red power dress, elegant and impossible to overlook. Across the marble hall, Dominic Alistair Vale smiled in an immaculate black suit beside Marielle Renford, who waited in a white dress, as if she already knew where the cameras would turn. Then the curtain dropped from the donor wall. Serafina's name was gone. In the place where her 3 years of strategy, private negotiations, late-night grant revisions, restricted pledge work, and donor trust should have been honored, the brass plaque read, Marielle Renford, Cultural Visionary Partner. The room applauded. That was the cruelest part. They were clapping for a lie, before they even understood whose life had been used to build it. Dominic did not look surprised. Marielle did not look confused. That was how Serafina knew this was not an error, not a careless omission, not some assistant's mistake hidden beneath opening night glamour. It had been planned, approved, engraved, and timed. Her phone showed the archive access update had arrived at 7:42 p.m., 2 minutes before the reveal. Too late. Dominic had tried to lock the door after forgetting who built the house. Serafina did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not give the trustees, reporters, or photographers the dramatic wife they could dismiss as emotional. She simply looked at the donor wall, then at Dominic, and understood the full shape of his cruelty. He had not only betrayed their marriage. He had tried to transfer her authorship to another woman in front of the very people whose trust she had earned. For years, Dominic had stood at podiums and accepted admiration, while Serafina remembered every donor's private condition, every restricted pledge, every family grief behind a public gift, every legal clause that turned vanity into legacy. He had worn the family name like a crown. She had made sure the crown did not collapse under its own emptiness. Now he stood beside Marielle, letting the lie breathe. A senior collector, Catherine Bellamy, approached with careful eyes and a lowered voice. Serafina, I thought your name would be there. Serafina turned to her calmly. So did the original agreement. Catherine's expression sharpened, not with gossip, but with calculation. In that world, one sentence could move millions if it touched the right document. Are you still overseeing the restricted pledges? She asked. Serafina allowed 1 silent second to pass. Not after tonight. Across the room, Dominic continued smiling for cameras, unaware that the first fracture had already formed beneath his museum's polished floor. Serafina did not need to accuse him. The truth had better posture than outrage. She stepped away from the celebration and entered the private foundation corridor, where the real power of the museum lived behind frosted glass. Donor histories, pledge letters, ethical conditions, contact maps, and the encrypted files she had created long before Dominic understood their value. Her access code still worked. She opened the cabinet assigned to her original advisory office, removed the slim black drive marked with a silver V, gathered her personal advisory records, legally retained copies of pledge letters, handwritten donor intelligence notebooks, and documents naming her as strategic oversight contact, then placed only those essential materials into her leather folio. On the desk lay the diamond clutch Dominic had given her that afternoon. She left it there. Luxury could stay with the man who mistook decoration for loyalty. Then she removed her wedding ring, slid it into a foundation envelope, sealed it, and wrote, Property classification for council review. Beneath that, she added, Do not return sentimental property to me. No speech, no tears, no audience, just a legal category where romance used to be. When Serafina exited through the staff entrance, the museum still glowed behind her, with champagne, cameras, and a beautiful lie carved in brass. She sent one message to Eleanor Price, her attorney. Begin separation protocol tonight. Then she looked back once at the glass doors, where Dominic's black suit moved beside Marielle's white dress, and whispered, Let him open a museum without its foundation. The car did not speed away from the museum. Serafina Voss had no interest in fleeing like a woman being chased. She sat in the back seat, with the donor files resting beside her, her vivid red dress catching the passing city lights like a controlled flame, and watched the museum shrink behind tinted glass until Dominic's celebration became nothing more than another illuminated lie in Manhattan. Her driver, Malcolm Reed, a composed man in his 50s who had worked for private clients long enough to understand silence, glanced once in the mirror and asked only, "Office or residence, Ms. Voss?" Serafina looked down at the leather folio beside her, where the legally retained donor materials rested in careful order, then at the city lights sliding across the window like silent witnesses. "Neither," she said. "Take me to Price and Row." That was the first clean cut. The penthouse could wait. The closet full of couture could wait. The crystal dining room, the private wine room, the framed wedding photograph Dominic had hung near the elevator because it looked good for guests. All of it could remain untouched for one more night. Luxury was useful only when it served freedom. After that, it became velvet around a cage. Serafina did not need the cage. At 8:47 p.m., she entered the private side lobby of Price and Row, where Eleanor Price had already instructed security to clear the elevator and prepare conference room 14. Eleanor was waiting in a charcoal suit, silver hair pinned back, legal pad open, eyes sharp enough to make grief feel inefficient. She did not ask Serafina if she was all right. Women like Eleanor understood that some betrayals had to be documented before they were mourned. Serafina placed the folio on the table. "He removed my name from the donor wall and replaced it with Marielle Renford." Eleanor's pen stopped. "Publicly, in front of trustees, press, and donors. And access. He attempted to update my archive permissions 2 minutes before the reveal." Eleanor leaned back, and the faintest expression crossed her face. Not surprise, but professional appetite. "Then he gave us timing." Serafina opened the folio and arranged the materials with the cold precision of someone laying surgical instruments on a tray. The donor files were not stolen trophies. They were her personal advisory records, legally retained copies, materials created before the foundation merger, and documents naming her as strategic oversight contact, many tied to ethical oversight clauses, personal trust conditions, and donor relationships she had cultivated before Dominic's foundation ever looked respectable. Dominic had wanted the public glory without the private obligations. He had forgotten that high society loved beauty, but it trusted paperwork. The first hour passed without tears. Eleanor cataloged assets, governance risks, foundation exposure, donor restrictions, intellectual contribution, and reputational harm. Serafina signed authorization for a controlled separation protocol, emergency financial review, and preservation notices for all communications related to the museum opening. The ring had already been sealed and classified before Serafina left the museum, so Eleanor did not reopen the moment. She simply logged it into the marital property file, marked it for council review, and moved on. That was what made the gesture final. No performance, no second explanation, no emotional ceremony repeated for effect. Near midnight, Serafina finally went to the penthouse, not to stay, but to take what mattered. She walked past imported marble, silent art, and flowers arranged by staff, who still believed she was returning from a successful gala. She packed no jewelry from Dominic, no gowns chosen for his cameras, no framed photographs, no anniversary gifts, no expensive apologies disguised as objects. She took her passport, personal notebooks, premarital business records, family heirloom earrings from her late aunt, 3 red dresses she had bought for herself, and a small bronze sculpture from a black artist she had championed before Dominic knew the artist's name. Everything else could remain behind and accuse him by its emptiness. At 12:36 a.m., she stood in the dressing room one final time, surrounded by luxury that suddenly looked rented from someone else's dream. Then she turned off the light. No slammed doors, no shattered glass, no farewell note on silk stationery. By morning, Dominic would find the penthouse intact, the closets almost full, the diamond clutch still at the museum, and the woman he thought he had humiliated already beyond his reach. Serafina stepped into the elevator carrying one suitcase and the donor files. She had left behind the life he could recognize. She kept the power he had never understood. You see, this is the part of the story where most people expect a woman to break in a way that makes everyone else comfortable. They expect the tears, the trembling hands, the dramatic confrontation in a marble hallway. Because if Serafina Voss had exploded at the museum, Dominic Alastairvale could have turned her pain into a performance and called it instability. That is the cruel intelligence of men like Dominic. They do not only betray, they prepare the room to misunderstand the woman they betrayed. He stood there in his elegant black suit, beside Marielle Renford in that carefully innocent white dress, knowing exactly what the donor wall would reveal, knowing exactly how public the humiliation would be, and still believing Serafina's dignity would trap her. He counted on her love of reputation. He counted on her refusal to make a scene. He counted on the old training so many brilliant women carry in their bones. Be graceful, be patient, do not embarrass the family, do not disturb the room, do not make powerful people uncomfortable with the truth. But here is what Dominic miscalculated. Grace is not obedience. Silence is not surrender. And a woman who has spent years reading donor agreements, emotional motives, governance clauses, and hidden power structures is not confused when someone tries to erase her in public. She is documenting. Tell me, what would you do if the empire you built with your mind suddenly used its own celebration to remove your name? Would you scream so they could call you bitter? Would you beg so they could call you dependent? Or would you do what Serafina did and leave with the one thing no husband, no mistress, no trustee, and no polished plaque can manufacture overnight? Trust. That is the deeper wound here. Dominic thought the donor files were administrative material, a background system, a cabinet full of names and numbers. He did not understand that those files represented human confidence, legacy planning, tax risk, ethical conditions, restricted promises, and the invisible emotional architecture of philanthropy. Wealthy donors do not give millions because a man looks impressive under museum lights. They give because someone serious has convinced them their money will be honored, protected, and connected to meaning. Serafina was that serious person. She remembered which donor funded restoration to preserve a family legacy. She knew which collector feared public scandal. She understood which family office needed legal clarity before releasing restricted funds. She held the thread Dominic did not even see. And when she walked out with the donor files, she was not stealing his power. She was reclaiming the map of her own labor. That distinction matters. A lesser story would make this about jealousy, about the red dress versus the white dress, about one woman replacing another beside a rich man. But that is too small for Serafina. Marielle was never the real enemy. She was a symptom in silk, a woman invited to stand where she had not built, smile where she had not sacrificed, and inherit language she had not earned. The real conflict was ownership. Who gets credit for invisible labor, who gets named on the wall, who gets called visionary, and who is expected to stand quietly while her brilliance is transferred like furniture. That is why Serafina's calm feels almost frightening. It is not numbness. It is evaluation. It is the moment a woman stops asking why he hurt her and starts asking what the consequences must be. Dominic wanted a wounded wife. What left the museum was a strategist. And believe me, there is nothing more dangerous to a self-satisfied man than a woman who no longer needs him to admit what she is worth. By sunrise, Serafina Voss had not slept, but exhaustion had not softened her mind. She sat in conference room 14 at Price and Row, with her red coat folded, over the back of her chair, a legal pad. Before her, the donor files arranged in disciplined stacks, and a cup of untouched black coffee cooling beside the sealed ring envelope. Eleanor Price returned, with 2 senior associates, both adults in tailored suits, and placed a preliminary governance report on the table, with the care of a surgeon setting down an X-ray. Dominic's problem is not the affair, Eleanor said. It is the sequence. Serafina looked up. The plaque, the access update, and the donor misrepresentation. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. The first legal strategy was preservation. Every message related to the museum opening, every donor credit revision, every board approval note, every access permission change, every document naming Marielle Renford as cultural visionary partner had to be frozen before Dominic's people could polish the lie. into an administrative decision. The second strategy was asset separation. Serafina's premarital advisory network, her private donor intelligence, her legally retained donor records, her intellectual contribution to the foundation, and any pledge language tied directly to her oversight had to be separated from Dominic's branding with absolute precision. The third strategy was donor continuity, and that was the blade Dominic had not seen coming. Eleanor reviewed a restricted pledge from the Bellamy family, then another from the Merriweather Conservation Trust, then a third from the Halden Arts Endowment. Each one contained language Serafina had insisted on years earlier: ethical oversight, transparent reporting, curatorial independence, and strategic review by the original advisory contact. Dominic had signed those documents because he wanted the money quickly. He had not read the clauses carefully because men like him often confuse signature authority with understanding. Serafina read every line. She always had. "We do not threaten him," she said. Eleanor's eyes lifted with approval. "No, we notify stakeholders of governance changes. And we do not solicit withdrawals. No, we advise donors to review their conditions." Serafina leaned back, calm and exact. "Let the documents speak, before anyone accuses me of speaking." That was the architecture of her revenge: clean, lawful, unanswerable. By 9:20 a.m., Dominic's first call came. Serafina watched his name appear on the phone screen and let it ring until it vanished. 30 seconds later, a message arrived: "We need to talk before this becomes ugly." She studied the words and felt no pull toward them. Ugly had already happened under museum lights, with brass letters and champagne applause. What Dominic feared now was not ugliness. It was record-keeping. Eleanor read the message and gave a thin smile. "Do you want to respond?" Serafina picked up her pen. "Through counsel only." By noon, Price and Rowe had issued formal notices preserving communications and requesting all foundation records related to donor credit changes, access restrictions, governance restructuring, and public attribution. A separate financial team began tracing shared discretionary accounts, foundation-adjacent expenses, advisory fees, and transfers made in the weeks before the opening. Serafina authorized temporary freezes where permitted, not to punish, but to prevent Dominic from burying marital and professional assets beneath foundation language. She knew his habits too well. He would call it confusion, then transition, then branding, then legal noise. She would call it by its proper name: evidence. That afternoon, Catherine Bellamy's counsel requested clarification on whether the family's acquisition pledge remained tied to Serafina's oversight. 2 other donor representatives followed within the hour. No scandal had broken yet. No headline had named Dominic. No gossip column had caught the scent. The damage was quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. It moved through law firms, private bankers, family offices, and trustee inboxes, where real consequences travel without needing applause. Dominic called again at 4:11 p.m. Then 4:18, then 4:26. Serafina did not answer. At 4:32, Eleanor's office received a message from his attorney requesting an amicable clarification before reputational harm occurs. Eleanor slid the printed email across the table. Serafina read it once. "He is still worried about reputation," she said, "not accountability." Eleanor capped her pen. "That distinction will matter." Serafina turned toward the window, where Manhattan stood bright, indifferent, and expensive beneath the afternoon sun. The city had seen countless men confuse wealth with immunity. It had also seen women learn the law well enough to make immunity very costly. She thought of the donor wall, Marielle's white dress, Dominic's black suit, and the polished space where her name should have been. Then she looked back at the documents and felt something colder than anger settle into place. Freedom, she realized, did not always arrive as a feeling. Sometimes it arrived as a filed notice, a frozen account, a timestamp, and a signature at the bottom of a page. Eleanor pushed the final authorization toward her. Serafina signed without hesitation. "Now," she said, "we protect what I built." Serafina Voss did not build her new life from spectacle. She built it from a desk, a legal firewall, and a calendar, so disciplined it left no room for collapse. 3 weeks after the museum opening, She signed the formation documents for Voss Meridian Arts Capital in a quiet private office on Madison Avenue, far smaller than Dominic Alistair Vale's glass-walled foundation headquarters, and precisely because of that, more honest. There were no champagne towers, no photographers, no trustees pretending surprise at a decision already purchased behind closed doors. There was only Serafina in a vivid red suit, Eleanor Price beside her, and a clean stack of operating agreements that placed governance, transparency, and donor protection at the center of everything Dominic had treated as decoration. No vanity board, Serafina said. Eleanor wrote it down. No symbolic appointments. No borrowed credibility. Especially that. The first months were brutal in the elegant way only elite rebuilding can be brutal. Serafina awoke before dawn in a temporary apartment overlooking the East River, reviewed market reports before her first coffee, took calls with family offices in Boston, Palm Beach, Chicago, and San Francisco, then spent afternoons drafting acquisition ethics frameworks that read less like corporate paperwork and more like moral architecture. She did not ask donors to abandon Dominic. She did not whisper scandal into private rooms. She simply made one statement, calm and consistent. Her name was no longer attached to the Vale Foundation, and any donor whose pledge depended on her oversight should review the original terms with counsel. That was enough. Wealth does not always move loudly. Sometimes it moves through amended letters, delayed wire transfers, paused commitments, and the discreet question every serious donor began asking. If Serafina is not there, who is protecting the promise? Her first major meeting was with Catherine Bellamy in a townhouse library, where the curtains were older than most startups, and the art on the walls had better insurance than small museums. Catherine listened while Serafina outlined a new advisory model for the Bellamy collection: independent curatorial review, public access guarantees, restoration transparency, and donor reporting that could survive both ego and scandal. Serafina did not flatter her. She did not perform gratitude. She gave Catherine the one luxury powerful people rarely received from polished institutions: competence without manipulation. Catherine closed the proposal and studied her for a long moment. Dominic said you were emotional. Serafina's expression did not move. Dominic confuses consequence with emotion. Catherine smiled faintly. I will move the conservation advisory work to you. That sentence became the first stone in the new empire. By the end of the quarter, Voss Meridian Arts Capital had 6 clients, all adults, all wealthy, all cautious, and all quietly relieved to be working with someone who understood that philanthropy was not a stage for rich men to practice legacy. Serafina hired only people who could defend a decision under pressure: a former museum compliance director, a tax strategist with ice in her veins, a provenance researcher who could detect a false ownership trail from one missing comma, and a communications advisor who knew the difference between dignity and silence. She built systems Dominic would have called excessive because he had never respected the invisible labor that prevented disasters. Every pledge had conditions. Every acquisition had review. Every donor relationship had documented intent. Every public credit had to match actual contribution. Marielle Renford, meanwhile, appeared in a glossy cultural magazine wearing another white dress, speaking about fresh energy in legacy spaces, with the empty confidence of someone repeating phrases prepared by a publicist. Serafina saw the article once, because her communications advisor placed it in a media risk brief. She read 3 sentences, then turned the page. Marielle was not her competition. A woman can stand under lights and still cast no institutional shadow. Dominic tried to respond by announcing a new cultural strategy council, but the announcement contained names Serafina recognized as decorative, not serious. 2 had no museum governance experience. 1 had resigned from a foundation audit the previous year. Another owed Dominic money through a private investment vehicle. Serafina said nothing publicly. Privately, she marked the risk map and moved faster. The work consumed her, but it did not hollow her out. It returned her to herself. Each late night at the office felt different from the years she had spent saving Dominic from his own vanity. Now, the exhaustion had authorship. The sacrifice had direction. The name on the documents was hers. One evening, after 14 hours of calls, revisions, and donor negotiations, Serafina stood alone in the unfinished conference room of Voss Meridian Arts Capital, looking at the temporary paper sign taped to the glass door. It was not marble. It was not engraved. It was not meant to impress anyone. Still, when she saw her own name printed there, unremoved, unshared, and undeniable, her throat tightened for the first time since the museum opening. She allowed herself one breath. Then she picked up a pen, corrected a clause in the Bellamy Agreement, and returned to work. Now, she whispered, we build something they cannot rename. Within 18 months, Voss Meridian Arts Capital became the firm people mentioned softly before making very large decisions. It did not rise through scandal, revenge interviews, or dramatic social exposure. It rose because Serafina Voss understood that true power in the art world was not noise, but confidence repeated, until it became market behavior. She wore red often now, not as armor against humiliation, but as a signature no one could edit. Walking into private boardrooms, collector salons, museum acquisition meetings, and international advisory dinners, with the stillness of someone who no longer needed permission to occupy the center of a room. Her firm advised on restoration funds in Boston, provenance reviews in Los Angeles, acquisition trusts in Chicago, and public access endowments in Washington, D.C. Each project carrying the same unmistakable discipline. Every promise documented, every donor protected, every artist treated as more than an asset class. The people who had once called her Dominic Alastair Vale's elegant wife began calling her before they called their lawyers. That was the measure of her ascent. Catherine Bellamy became her most visible supporter, but not her only one. The Meriwether Conservation Trust moved 2 major restoration pledges under her advisory umbrella. The Halden Arts Endowment asked her to restructure a private collection gift after 3 museums failed to satisfy the family's ethical terms. A San Francisco technology patron, who had once dismissed cultural philanthropy as reputation management, signed with Serafina after she explained, in 9 calm minutes, why legacy purchased without stewardship always decayed into vanity. She did not flatter money. She educated it. That was why money listened. In every room, Serafina's brilliance carried a different temperature from Dominic's old charm. Dominic had performed certainty. Serafina built it. Dominic had used marble, black suits, press language, and inherited intimidation to make people believe he belonged above them. Serafina used evidence, memory, governance, and emotional intelligence to make people understand they were safer beside her. At the annual Meridian Public Art Summit, she delivered a keynote on ethical patronage before a ballroom of adult curators, collectors, trustees, attorneys, and cultural investors. She did not mention Dominic. She did not mention Marielle Renford. She did not mention the donor wall. She simply spoke about the danger of institutions that confuse branding with stewardship, and by the end of the speech, half the room knew exactly whom she meant without needing her to lower herself into accusation. A name on a building is not legacy, she said from the stage. Legacy is whether the people who trusted you would choose to trust you again. The applause came slowly at first, then fully, not because the line was cruel, but because it was clean. Later that evening, an older museum chair approached her and said, "You have become the standard." Serafina accepted the compliment with grace, but privately, she understood something more important. She had not become the standard. She had stopped shrinking herself so weaker people could pretend they were tall. Meanwhile, Voss Meridian Arts Capital moved into a permanent office overlooking Bryant Park, not ostentatious, but exacting. Walnut conference tables, archival lighting, secure records rooms, rotating exhibitions by emerging adult artists, and a donor wall designed differently from Dominic's marble lie. No name appeared there, unless the contribution, role, and responsibility had been verified in writing. Serafina insisted on it. Credit is governance, she told her team. Treat it that way. Her staff learned quickly that she was demanding, but never careless, elegant, but never ornamental, kind but never available for exploitation. She remembered birthdays, legal deadlines, moral conditions, and the quiet shift in a donor's voice when a gift was tied to legacy. She also remembered every locked door, every erased line, and every smile, from the night Dominic mistook public humiliation for control. But the memory no longer burned her. It refined her. At a private dinner in Boston, surrounded by collectors, who once entered Dominic's rooms first, Catherine Bellamy lifted a glass and offered a toast that traveled through elite circles by morning. To Serafina Voss, she said, the woman who made culture solvent again. Serafina smiled, not because she needed the approval, but because she recognized the reversal. Her name was no longer something a man could remove from a wall. It had become the wall others built around their trust. Dominic Alastair Vale's collapse did not begin with a headline. It began with silence from people who used to answer his calls before the second ring. At first, he dismissed the delayed pledges as caution, the postponed meetings as scheduling, the donor questions as temporary discomfort around a transition he still refused to call a betrayal. He sat at the head of the Vale Foundation boardroom in an elegant black suit, the city shining behind him like proof he still mattered, and told his trustees that cultural money always returned to strength. But the quarterly report lay on the polished table, with no respect for his confidence. For restricted gifts had been paused. 2 acquisition commitments had been moved into legal review. The Bellamy Conservation Advisory work had formally shifted to Voss Meridian Arts Capital. Dominic read the figures twice, then a third time, as if arithmetic might become loyal if stared at long enough. This is a temporary optics problem, he said. No one agreed quickly enough. That was new. Before Serafina left, silence in that room had meant obedience. Now it meant calculation. The board chair, Leonard Hargrove, adjusted his glasses and asked why. So many donor agreements contained oversight language tied to Serafina's strategic role. Dominic's jaw tightened. She was involved administratively. A trustee across the table closed her folder. The documents suggest otherwise. That sentence landed harder than accusation, because it had evidence inside it. Marielle Renford sat near the far end of the table in a white dress that seemed increasingly wrong for daylight, her posture delicate, her expression arranged into concern, her notes almost empty. She had been given a title, an office, and a communications team, but she could not answer the questions Serafina once handled without looking down. When asked about the Merriweather restrictions, she referred vaguely to ongoing cultural alignment. When asked about the Halden Ethical Review, she smiled and said the foundation remained deeply committed to meaningful stewardship. The room did not punish her with open cruelty. It did something worse. It stopped expecting substance from her. Dominic felt it happen and resented the mirror she had become. The consultants he hired made the situation more expensive, not more stable. They redesigned donor decks, drafted language about renewal, and advised a listening tour among major families who no longer trusted the foundation's listening. Dominic increased press spending, purchased glossy profiles, and appeared beside Marielle at cultural events, where photographers still captured glamour, but donors saw strain beneath the lighting. Marielle knew where to stand for cameras. She did not know which donor had funded a wing after losing a spouse, which family office required independent reporting, which collector avoided institutions with unclear provenance policies, or which trustee had quietly warned Serafina about Dominic's ego years earlier. She had inherited a stage and mistaken it for a system. Now the stage lights were exposing the missing machinery. The first damaging article did not accuse Dominic of infidelity or cruelty. It asked a more lethal question. Why had the founding strategic architect of the museum wing been removed from public credit days before multiple donor restrictions came under review? Dominic's communications advisor called it manageable. His general counsel called it sensitive. His private banker called it unfortunate. Dominic called Serafina again. She did not answer. He sent one message. "You are hurting something we built together." She replied through Eleanor Price 2 hours later. All foundation matters should proceed through counsel. Nothing in the sentence was emotional enough for him to use. That enraged him more than any insult. By late autumn, the board demanded an independent governance audit. Dominic entered the meeting prepared to dominate it, black suit immaculate, cufflinks severe, voice trained into calm authority. Then the auditors displayed a timeline. Plaque revision approved, before the opening, access permission update minutes, before the reveal, donor credit language altered, without full committee review, and multiple communications implying Serafina's continued oversight after her role had been effectively erased. The room went still. Dominic's hand moved toward his water glass, then stopped because he saw it tremble. For the first time in years, he could not convert attention into control. Leonard Hargrove asked whether he had knowingly allowed donors to believe Serafina remained attached to restricted commitments after the museum event. Dominic opened his mouth. No answer came. It was not a dramatic collapse. He did not fall, beg, or weep. He simply lost his voice in the most expensive room he owned. Marielle looked at him, waiting for the man who had promised her a cultural throne to rescue the story, but the story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to documents, timelines, donors, auditors, and the woman in red, who had left before he understood what leaving meant. Leonard closed the audit folder with careful finality. "Dominic," he said, "we need to discuss whether you are still the right person to lead this foundation." Outside the boardroom windows, Manhattan continued glittering, as if nothing historic had happened. Inside, Dominic stared at the empty chair Serafina used to occupy, and finally understood that she had not walked out of his empire. She had taken the load-bearing walls with her. The reunion happened in Geneva, inside the private evening session of the Aurelian International Art Auction, where wealth did not need to raise its voice, because every raised paddle could move a museum's future. Dominic Alastair Vale arrived in an elegant black suit that still fit his body, but no longer fit his circumstances, his face controlled, his posture polished, his eyes carrying the fatigue of a man who had spent months negotiating with consequences. Marielle Renford stood beside him in a white gown chosen to look delicate under chandelier light, but delicacy had curdled into anxiety. She smiled when collectors glanced her way, then looked to Dominic whenever serious conversation began. He had come to Geneva for the Bellamy collection acquisition rights, the one project that could restore enough credibility to slow the board's pressure and convince donors that the Vale Foundation still belonged in the room. He needed the acquisition to look like a comeback. He needed the room to believe his name still carried weight. Then Serafina Voss entered in red. The effect was not loud, and that made it more devastating. Conversations softened, not because people were shocked to see her, but because they had been waiting to see whom she would greet first. A museum director from London stepped away from a sovereign art advisor to kiss her cheek. Catherine Bellamy crossed the room with visible warmth. Two family office representatives moved toward her with the alertness of people who knew their evening strategy might change depending on where she stood. Serafina accepted each greeting with her usual composed precision, her red gown clean-lined and powerful, her hair swept back, her diamonds minimal, her presence impossible to borrow. She did not look at Dominic immediately. That was the first defeat. Dominic watched the room reorient around her, without permission from him, and something in his chest tightened with the old disbelief that had ruined him. He still expected power to explain itself when it left. Marielle whispered, "Should we speak to her?" Dominic did not answer. He was staring at Catherine Bellamy, who had once waited outside his office for foundation approval and now stood beside Serafina, as if the future had already changed addresses. The auction began, with smaller lots, but everyone in that room understood the evening had only one true battlefield. The Bellamy collection acquisition rights included stewardship over a rare modernist archive, a traveling exhibition partnership, and a public access endowment designed to shape institutional prestige for the next decade. Dominic had pursued it for years, even before he knew how to manage the donors behind it. Serafina had understood the collection differently. To Dominic, it was recovery. To Serafina, it was responsibility. When the lot was introduced, Dominic lifted his paddle early, aggressive enough to signal confidence. A few bidders tested the range, then retreated. Marielle exhaled too soon. Dominic's mouth settled into the faint smile he used when he believed the room had remembered who he was. Serafina remained still. She let him climb. She let the number rise beyond comfort and into desperation. She watched his knuckles tighten, watched his advisor lean in, watched the small panic behind his expensive restraint. Then, with almost no movement, she raised her paddle. The auctioneer acknowledged Voss Meridian Arts Capital, and the room changed temperature. Dominic looked over at her then, fully, and for the first time, that evening Serafina met his eyes. There was no hatred in her gaze. Hatred would have made him feel central. There was only assessment. He bid again. She waited. Another bidder entered, then withdrew after Catherine Bellamy gave a barely perceptible nod towards Serafina's table. Dominic understood too late that he had not walked into a contest between former spouses. He had walked into a consortium already aligned before he boarded his plane. Serafina had not come to outbid his ego. She had come to secure the project properly. The final number arrived, with the quiet violence of inevitability. Dominic's advisor touched his sleeve, warning him that another bid would trigger financing questions the board could not survive. His hand hovered near the paddle. It trembled once, then lowered. Marielle's face went pale beneath the careful softness of her makeup, and she looked towards Serafina with the frightened recognition of someone finally seeing the difference between being displayed and being obeyed. The auctioneer lifted the hammer. Acquired by Voss Meridian Arts Capital. The sound was small, clean, absolute. Applause moved through the room, measured but unmistakable, and Serafina arose only after the acquisition was formally recorded. Catherine Bellamy reached for her hand and said, "My family will be proud to see it under your stewardship." Serafina inclined her head. "Then we will honor it correctly." Across the aisle, Dominic remained seated as the applause passed around him without touching him. His black suit, once a symbol of command, now looked like formal wear for a funeral no one had announced. Serafina gathered her documents, turned toward the private signing room, and walked past him without slowing. For one unbearable second, Dominic seemed ready to speak her name. But the room was watching, and he no longer trusted his voice. Serafina did not need to hear it. She had already won the only answer that mattered. Dominic Alistair Vale found Serafina Voss outside the private signing room, in a corridor paneled with dark wood and guarded by the kind of silence only old money could afford. She had just finished reviewing the Bellamy collection acquisition rights with her counsel and Catherine Bellamy's representatives, her red gown still immaculate, her posture calm, her signature drying on documents that had closed the door on Dominic's last chance at recovery. He approached without Marielle Renford at his side. That alone told Serafina he understood something had changed. In the auction room, Marielle's white gown had made her look ornamental. In this corridor, her absence made Dominic look exposed. His black suit was still perfect, but perfection no longer protected him. "Serafina," he said. Her name sounded different in his mouth now, less like possession and more like a password he no longer had the right to use. She turned, not startled, not softened, not angry. "Dominic." He swallowed once, and the motion betrayed more than any apology could have. "I need 5 minutes." Serafina glanced toward her attorney, who remained several feet away, with professional stillness. "You have 3. That was the first mercy, and he seemed wounded by its precision. Dominic tried to begin, as the man he used to be, smooth, controlled, quietly superior, but the old rhythm broke before the second sentence. He spoke of pressure from the board, of donor confusion, of Marielle's title being a mistake of optics, of the foundation needing stability before the audit became irreversible. He said they had built something extraordinary together. He said the Bellamy acquisition could have saved hundreds of commitments. He said he had mishandled the opening, then stopped, because even he heard the weakness of that word. Mishandled. As if erasure were poor timing. As if humiliation were a scheduling error. Serafina listened with the same stillness that had terrified him at the museum. She did not interrupt, because interruption would have rescued him from his own language. He kept speaking until the truth finally appeared beneath all his polished phrases. He did not miss her laughter. He did not ask whether she had been lonely. He did not mention the years she had spent translating his vanity into institutional trust. He missed the donor calls being answered. He missed the board believing him. He missed the way her mind had made his name look inevitable. "Come back as strategic chair," he said at last, his voice lower. "Not publicly at first. We can structure it through a transitional advisory agreement. You would have full authority over donor continuity." Serafina looked at him for a long moment. "So you are offering me permission to repair the institution that erased me?" His face tightened. "I am offering partnership." "No," she said. You are offering access to damage. The words landed cleanly. Dominic's hand moved slightly, not reaching for her, only betraying the tremor he could not command away. I made a terrible mistake. You made a sequence of decisions. He closed his eyes for half a second. I was arrogant. You were documented. That sentence emptied the corridor. For the first time, Dominic seemed to understand that apology could not negotiate with evidence. Serafina stepped closer, not with intimacy, but with finality. Trust is not a decorative asset, Dominic. Credit is not transferable. A woman's mind is not marital property. And the donors did not leave because I poisoned them against you. They left because your own paperwork proved you were willing to take the money, while removing the person responsible for protecting it. His mouth opened, but no argument came. Beyond him, at the far end of the corridor, Marielle appeared in her white gown, standing still enough to seem like a figure painted into the wall. She heard enough. Serafina did not look at her. There was nothing to win from humiliating a woman who had accepted a title without understanding the debt attached to it. Dominic's voice broke into something quieter, almost human. Was there ever a version where you forgave me? Serafina considered the question, and for the first time, that evening, a trace of sadness moved through her eyes. Not longing, not regret, recognition. There was a version where you never made me necessary to your ambition and disposable to your pride. He looked down then, not collapsing, not weeping, simply losing the last structure of his self-defense. And now, he asked. Serafina turned toward the signing room, where her future waited in ink, counsel, stewardship, and names that would remain where they belonged. Now you confuse forgiveness with access. She paused once, giving him the dignity of a clear ending. You did not lose me at the museum, Dominic. You documented why I had to leave. Then she walked away, red against the dark corridor, while Dominic stood in his perfect black suit, with nothing left to command but his own silence. 6 months after Geneva, Serafina Voss stood inside the newly opened Voss Meridian Institute for Public Art Stewardship, watching adult curators, collectors, scholars, attorneys, and artists move through a space built on the principles Dominic Alistair Vale had once treated as decorative: credit, transparency, protection, and trust. Her name appeared at the entrance in clean bronze letters, not larger than necessary, not designed to humiliate anyone, simply placed where it belonged. She wore red again, but now the color did not feel like armor. It felt like authorship. Across the city, the Vale Foundation had survived only by removing Dominic from executive authority, restructuring donor oversight, and publicly correcting the museum wing's attribution record. Marielle Renford disappeared from cultural leadership as quietly as she had entered it, leaving behind photographs that looked increasingly like evidence of a borrowed room. Dominic sent one final letter, through counsel, formally acknowledging Serafina's contribution to the original foundation structure. She read it once, filed it, and felt no triumph in the old sense. Triumph had become something quieter, sleeping without waiting for betrayal, signing documents under her own name, choosing rooms where no one expected her to be grateful for partial respect. And you see, that is the part people often misunderstand about women like Serafina. They think the revenge is watching a man fall. It is not. The real victory is becoming so whole that his fall no longer organizes your life. Dominic tried to erase her from marble because he believed visibility was the source of power, but Serafina proved that power lives deeper than a plaque. It lives in competence, memory, discipline, and the courage to leave, without begging the room to admit what it already knows. Tell me, have you ever seen someone mistake your silence for weakness? Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is the sound of a woman choosing the door, the key, and the empire waiting on the other side. Serafina looked at the donor wall, where every name had been verified, honored, and correctly placed, then smiled with peaceful certainty. This time, she said, nothing true will be removed. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.